again, so if you could all come in and find a seat, we'll get started this morning. Everybody take the last swigs of coffee, liquid wakey time elixir, get our brains firing. Good morning and welcome to week 4 on week 5 of our study in Joshua and Judges, Conquest and Consequences. I'd like to take a moment to greet everyone who is joining us online and joining our live stream. I always appreciate the fact that so many people do that, and I'll take an indulgent moment to just say, hi Mom, hi Elsie, they're both in France. But they always take the time to join us for class. So it's been 2 weeks since we've been able to have our last class due to weather, and you may have been hoping that that was just going to be a recurrent thing, but unfortunately, you're back with me. We got to keep on going, and we're going to have to really buckle it down because I'm going to cover 2 classes this morning in one session. So we're really going to. I'm just kidding. I'm just going to have to rework what we're doing. We're just going to do one class worth of material, which is probably 50% more than I should try, but there we go. So it's been a couple of weeks, and so we're going to go through just a little bit of a review, a little bit of a reminder so that we remember where we're at. So remember, we called this class Conquest and Consequences, and remember we talked about in week 1 that the conquest of Canaan was actually a consequence of the sin of the people living there. Remember that rather than Israel just winning a good land for themselves, they are in fact acting on behalf of God's justice. Right? They are carrying out God's justice against a sinful people. And so this isn't a massacre, this isn't a genocide, it's nothing evil or wrong about what's happening. It is in fact simply God's long-coming justice against the people of the land. And then in week 2, we looked at the preparation that God put his people through to enter the Holy Land, to enter the land of Canaan. He put them through a tremendous amount of preparation. He gave them everything that they needed to know. And we looked particularly at the refrain of be strong and courageous. Remember how that was repeated over and over throughout Deuteronomy and into the beginning of Joshua. Be strong and courageous. And that was really all that the people needed to do. They needed to do all that God commanded them to do, and then to meditate on his word, to remember that God was the one in charge and that all they needed to do was focus on him, to put him first, to give his considerations first to the top of their mind. That was really all they needed to do when they entered the land. Strength and courage was shown by their dependence on God and their adherence to his teaching. And then after that, we looked at the people crossing into the land of Canaan, crossing the Jordan. And if you remember when God created that incredible miracle of separating the water and shutting off the waters of the Jordan so that they could cross over in this huge area, and they picked up those stones, and they set up those stones to be a reminder to them. And we asked, what do these stones mean to you? Because remember, the stones were intended to stand as a memorial for the people so that they would always remember the work that God had done on their behalf. And so as they go about their daily lives, as they go about doing the things God would have them to do in the land, they are to remember all that God has done for them, everything God did to bring them to that point, and that all of the blessings of the land are due not to anything they've accomplished, but instead are due to what God has accomplished on their behalf. In fact, their own efforts have been completely futile in this regard in order to get them where they are in this promised land. And all of that was summed up then by our memory verse, by the fact that God has given us and given them a choice. Remember, all of this keeps coming back to the fact that God has given them a choice and he wants them to make the right choice. And so you remember our memory verse, and we're going to say this together now. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your seed, by loving Yahweh your God, by listening to his voice, and by holding fast to him. By listening to his voice and holding fast to Him. Is that not the very definition of be strong and courageous? Do you see how these things keep repeating? God keeps repeating so that the people will understand. Listen to me. Depend upon me. Trust me. I have the power and I have promised to do these things for you. So choose me, because He is the source of life. So now this week we're going to look back. Remember when we looked at the crossing of the Jordan, we actually skipped ahead a little bit. And so now we're going to look back at chapter 2. So keep in mind the thread that we're following throughout all of these books and then all the way to our lives. Remember, we're looking for connections. We're looking for the connections that are there. And so we're following this thread through Joshua, through Judges, all the way to our lives. The thread that we're following is the choice that God gives. The choice that God gives, not just His people, but all people. And so this morning I want us to look at the choice, and the choices made by Rahab, by Jericho, by Joshua and the people. So as we begin our lesson this morning, we're going to see Joshua is going to send men from their camp into the land of Canaan, and they are intended to look about the land. We often refer to them as spies. So let's read this together. Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, "Go see the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came into the house of a harlot whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from." Now it happened when it was time to shut the gate at dark that the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and concealed them in the stalks of flax which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan to the fords, and as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. So it's kind of an interesting circumstance how Joshua sends out these men. We refer to them as the spies. Interestingly, Joshua doesn't end up referring to them as spies, but nevertheless, they are sent to scout out the land. They're sent to look around, and they go into Jericho, and they have this meeting with this woman that they're staying with. Now, a great deal is often made of the fact of Rahab being a harlot or being a prostitute. Now, it is kind of interesting, and I don't mean to just stir up a bunch of dirt to muddy the water, but it is kind of interesting that in other ancient writings, and particularly in Josephus, when he writes about these events, when he refers to Rahab, he in fact refers to her as an innkeeper. And they don't make mention of her being a prostitute or being a harlot. But the text in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, when she is referenced, is very clear. There's not any mistaking in what those words mean. And so I'm not trying to say that the Scripture is somehow incorrect. I think the Scripture is very accurate that she was, in fact, a harlot or a prostitute. But it does kind of make me think sometimes about the nature of Rahab, because in the past, it seems the Jewish theologians and the Jewish historians were kind of invested in cleaning up her history a little bit. They didn't really want to talk about her being a harlot, and so they talked about her owning a place in which people could come and stay, which she clearly did, because they came to stay in her home. So I think she was, in fact, an innkeeper, but she also was a harlot. The two apparently went together at that time, or particularly in that place. And so I do wonder if perhaps these references are an effort to clean up her history because she plays such a prominent role in this event. But either way, she is clearly a known person in the city of Jericho. She is a person of some level of prominence, I would say, if only for the fact that her word is trusted. When the king sends note to her saying, "Hey, where are these men?" And she tells him, "I don't know, they came here, they left, you should go chase them down."
He takes her at her word, and he then sends out men to pursue them. So she is a person who is trusted in the city. And of course, the scripture makes no attempt to conceal who or what she was, but it instead allows her faithful actions to speak for themselves. That is the nature, that is one of those clues that we have to the scripture being truthful and accurate, because there's no attempt to hide who Rahab was, but instead it allows her actions to speak for themselves. And so perhaps people in the past, perhaps these historians have made too little of the fact that she was a harlot, and perhaps we on the other end have made too much of it. The simple fact is, that's who she was, that is what she did. But the point we need to draw out of Rahab is the choices that she made when she was put into this situation. When she had this situation arise, the important thing to remember is the choice she made, and particularly how her choice was different than the king of Jericho. How it was different than the people of Jericho. Notice what she says to the men of Israel who are in her home. Looking at verse 8. I know, she says, that Yahweh has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea. Remember, this is before he dried up the Jordan. This is before they have crossed over. How he dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. Indeed, we heard it, and our hearts melted, and a courageous spirit no longer rose up in any man because of you. For Yahweh your God, notice this, underline it in your text if you haven't already. For Yahweh your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. What an extraordinary testimony from this person who otherwise you would just consider to be a pagan prostitute. But this is the testimony that she presents to the men of Israel. She tells them that the people in the land know about the events of the Exodus. Now keep in mind, this has been 40 years since these things took place. And yet she remembers them. She remembers what God did. And she says that all the inhabitants of the land, in fact, remember what God did. She recognizes the power of God at the very minimum. She recognizes the power of God over their own pagan beliefs, over their own pagan gods. Now notice that she refers to the Amorite kings as being what? As devoted to destruction. Now this is a very specific word, and it's not used all that often, but it's going to come up again shortly. In fact, Joshua is going to use it here shortly. But this term means that that we translate devoted to destruction. It really indicates a ritual or sacrificial destruction. It is a destruction for a spiritual purpose or as part of a ceremonial process. So even then, she recognizes that the destruction Israel is bringing into the land is not just some geopolitical conflict. They're not just some set of invaders the way the Philistines are. She recognizes this as being part of a ritual or spiritual process coming from the one God she recognizes as being all-powerful. Now she understands then why her people are at risk. She understands why she and her family are at risk. She doesn't see this attack from a conquering army, but she sees it as judgment from an all-powerful God. Notice how she describes God. Look at this term that she puts to him. He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. This ends up being echoed later, and I know we already read this because we jumped ahead, but it's echoed later by Joshua when he describes God as Lord of all the earth. But she says, we know about these pagan gods. We know about our territorial gods. We know about this idol versus this idol versus this idol. And she says, but I know that Yahweh is the God of everything above and everything beneath. There is nothing outside of the purview of the God of Israel. That is the testimony of Rahab to these men. She understands these things. She knows these things about God. Starting in verse 12, this is the request that Rahab makes. So now, please swear to me by Yahweh, since I have shown loving kindness to you, that you also will show loving kindness to my father's household and give me a pledge of truth, and preserve my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters alive with all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. So the men said to her, our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours, and it will be when Yahweh gives us the land that we will show loving kindness and truth to you. This is the promise that she asks of the men of Israel. And I love Rahab's response to the choice. Because in this moment, in these circumstances, she is presented with the choice. What do I do with these men who represent God Almighty? Do I give them to the king, or do I arrange to set them free? Neither one of those would have stopped God's plan. That's something to keep in mind. No matter which one she chose, it wouldn't have prevented God from doing what he was going to do. But it makes all the difference to her. It makes all the difference to Rahab and to her family. And I love this response that she gives. Particularly, I love the translation into this conjugated word of loving kindness. Now, your translation may not create that conjugation. It's typically one that's found in the New American Standard and a couple of other translations, the LSB that I'm using this morning. But I love this conjugation of loving kindness because it means more than just a simple friendliness or a simple act of kindness. It is most often used to refer to God's covenant love for his people and the acts of loving kindness he bestows upon them. Because it's more than just typical blessings. It's more than just this reciprocal relationship of we offered sacrifice and so he gave us blessings. This loving kindness in reference to God's covenant relationship means that God is acting to his people, to the people that he has in this relationship, out of his love for them. It is a kindness based on faithful love. And that's why it's so often attributed to God. But Rahab uses it in reference to herself and to the men of Israel. She has acted as though she were in covenant relationship with them. And then she asks that they act the same in return. She shows loving kindness, faithful love and kindness to them, and she asks that they then show loving kindness to her, based in this faithful response to God. She has shown them love based on faith in Yahweh, the one true God who she has determined his judgments are right, and she has determined that God alone can save her and her family. And so she makes the choice to choose life. And she asks then for this promise from the men. This is the first sign that we see that even at this late stage, even though we know the consequences of the sin of the people in this land and that God has come in order to enact his justice against them, even at this late stage, they can still choose to do right. It's not a foregone conclusion. God's not going to strike them down no matter what. Rahab makes the choice. Even at this late stage, she chooses life, and God, through these men, promises to save her. But that's a different choice than the people of Jericho. It's a different choice that is made by the king of Jericho. Because what does it say? It says that the gates of Jericho are shut. It is later reiterated that they are shut up tight. The king of Jericho makes his choice too. He closes up the gate. He says, "We are a mighty fortified city. Come and do your worst," is what the king of Jericho says. And we know how that turns out. But she makes a different choice. She then makes this arrangement with them that she's going to do what? She's going to mark her home with a scarlet cord. They say, hang the scarlet cord out of your window so that when we enter the city, we will know not to come into your home. And everyone in her home will be saved. You know, sometimes we get the impression that it was just Rahab that was saved. But it was Rahab, it was her parents, it was her brothers, it was her sisters, and she says, and all that belonged to them. I kind of get the impression that it was a big old group of people huddled in her house that day. It kind of reminds me of Noah on the ark, how it was him and his children and their wives. And it reminds me of what was supposed to happen in Sodom and Gomorrah, bringing the entire family out. It's just a good reminder of God's mercy. Even at this late stage, God's mercy for Rahab's family. And so she marks her home with a scarlet cord. And when does Rahab put out the cord? Does she put it out when she sees them marching around the city? Does she throw it out the window as soon as the walls fall down? When did the text say that she puts out the cord? They're barely off of the wall. Their feet touch the ground and her cord is out the window. That means that cord hung out of her window for at bare minimum 10 days. As soon as they leave, she puts that cord out to mark her home. And so after these events, we then have the crossing of the Jordan. The people are now encamped at Gilgal. The power of God has once again been demonstrated over all of nature, heaven above and earth below. God is powerful over everything. And they're now at Gilgal, and they're encamped directly across from Jericho. They are basically within sight of Jericho, although because of the lay of the land, they probably couldn't see Jericho. Jericho's in a very low spot. It's the lowest city in the world, in fact, just north of the Dead Sea. So they're encamped at Gilgal, and Joseph then has an interesting encounter, and I meant to put that up. Rahab takes action as though she's in covenant relationship with them and asks that they act in kind. But in chapter 5, and starting in verse 13, Joshua has an interesting meeting. Now it happened when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" He said, "No. Rather, I indeed come now as commander of the host of Yahweh." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What has my Lord to say to his slave?" The commander of the host of Yahweh said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Again, in this bizarre encounter, we are again presented with the circumstances of choice. Joshua puts the choice on this man that just appears out of nowhere. He looks over and there's a man standing there with a sword drawn. And so he puts the choice to him. Are you for us or are you for them? Are you for us or are you for our adversaries? But then the response of the commander is to say, neither. Neither. And it's important to note this, particularly as we go through the rest of the conquest of this land and all the consequences that are brought upon this land. The commander of the host of Yahweh says that God is neither inherently for Israel nor against Jericho. He is neither inherently for Israel nor against Jericho. Rather, the question is, Joshua and Jericho, whose side are you on? Whose side are you on is the question. So many times we get this question backwards in our mind. So many times we start wondering, is God on my side? And it's the wrong question. The question that the commander puts to Joshua, the question that we have to answer, the question that Jericho had to answer is, whose side are you on? Do you choose to be on God's side? And though Joshua has just at this time been elevated by God directly to being the head of his people, what does Joshua do? He immediately submits to the authority of the commander of the hosts of Yahweh. He recognizes where his authority comes from. And he says, what does he say? What has my Lord to say to his slave? He immediately submits to the source of his authority. Now in chapter 6, just after this, Joshua receives instructions for how the destruction of Jericho is supposed to take place. That's where he gets the instructions about how the ark is supposed to move, how the priests are supposed to move. And we're going to look at that here in a moment. But it is interesting that in chapter 6, those instructions and those words are declared to be from Yahweh. It says, Yahweh spoke to Joshua. And so many times in our mind, we attribute this to the commander. We think, well, he was just there. It must be him speaking. And so it creates all of these questions of, well, who is this guy? Is he God in the flesh? Is he Jesus? Is he an angel? But there doesn't seem to be anything supernatural about him. He's just a guy standing there. He then draws this connection back to Moses in the burning bush by saying, remove your sandals, for this place is holy. And the simple fact is, we don't know exactly who this person was. I think Daniel made a pretty solid case that it was a representation of Jesus, but we simply don't know who this person was. And it's not the only time that it says Yahweh speaks directly to Joshua. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the instructions attributed to Yahweh are coming directly from this commander. And so we always get bogged down into who this guy was, instead of simply recognizing that God has now demonstrated to Joshua, I am already here, ready to fight the battle. All you need to do is be strong and courageous, to do all that I command and remember my words. That's what this man represents. That's what his instructions represent. God is already there to fight the battle. All Joshua has to do is submit, and notice, Joshua does submit. So when we look at chapter 6 and starting in verse 2, it says this, and Yahweh said to Joshua, see that I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and all the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it will be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down beneath itself, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead. Now these instructions, they're so interesting, because they're not really military tactics, are they? It's not really a siege of a city. It's not really an assault of a city. What does it more resemble? A religious ceremony, doesn't it? It resembles a religious ritual. Because sure, they circle the city, and the people in Jericho might be thinking, we're under siege. And then what do? They go around once, and then they go back to camp. Oh, I guess we're not under siege. And then they come back the next day and they do it again. And then they leave again. And they keep having this on and off thing, but it's not really a military tactic. It's not really a military process at all, but rather a religious ritual that bears more similarities to how they would be preparing for the atonement and the sacrifice. And so they're not really preparing for a military action against Jericho, but instead, as Rahab understood, they are preparing for a religious action against Jericho. And so we have all of the instructions that they're given and they're supposed to follow. Joshua then relays all of this information to the people. He repeats everything that Yahweh has told him. He relays it to the people and he adds this. And the city shall be devoted to destruction. That's the same terminology that Rahab used. It represents this ritual sacrifice, this spiritual sacrifice. The city will be devoted to destruction. It and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. Now, isn't that an interesting thing? He doesn't call them spies. He calls them messengers. Did you ever wonder why they got caught so fast? I mean, they're either really bad spies or we're really misunderstanding what they were actually there to do. Joshua refers to them as messengers. But either way, he says the entire city is to be devoted as spiritual sacrifice. Everything in it belongs to God. Only Rahab and all who are with her shall live. Why? Because she doesn't belong to God? No, because she does. Because she does belong to God. Because she is now in covenant relationship with God. Because she has made the choice to choose God. Rahab and all who are with her in the house shall live because she hid the messengers that we sent, he says. So we need to stop here. And we're going to discuss some connections that I see here. And Lord willing, we're going to look at the actual destruction of Jericho and then the conflict with the city of Ai later, hopefully next week. Lord willing, next week if we don't have another weather catastrophe. But I want us to see here the parallels between Rahab, Israel, and us, and the choice that we all must make. Now I want you to notice, and this is going to sound confusing at first, so please listen to me. Please make your best effort to understand what I'm saying. Notice that in the destruction of Jericho, the first city that they come into conflict with, actually in the land of Canaan, kind of forgetting the fact that the king of the Amorites decided to pick a fight with them and got what they got. But this is the first true city of the conquest that they come into contact with. And in the destruction of Jericho, the people of Israel are both fully passive and fully active. Do you hear what I'm saying? They are both fully passive and fully active. And it's not even so much that God does part of it and then Israel does part of it. It's not defined that way. It's not really broken down that way. Rather, God does everything, and the people do everything, but it is defined and determined by the covenant relationship that they have with God. They are both fully passive and fully active. God does everything, and the people do everything as determined by the covenant relationship that God has established with them. Think about this. God could destroy Jericho without the people. Is there any doubt about that? Has God demonstrated before that He can destroy entire cities without anybody's help? Yes, He has. So God doesn't need their help. He doesn't need them to do anything to destroy Jericho. However, in order to remain in covenant relationship with God, the people must act in the way that God commands them to act. Do we see that? God does not need them to destroy the city, but in order to remain in covenant relationship with God, they must do everything that God has instructed them to do. If they are to be the sword of God's justice, they must fully act in the ways that God has commanded, all while recognizing that their actions are done because of what God has accomplished, not in order to bring it about. Do we see the distinction there? They must fully act under what God has instructed them to do as part of their covenant relationship because of what God has already accomplished, not in order to bring it about. Marching around for days did not knock down the walls, but obedience to God's instruction was necessary in order for Israel to remain in covenant relationship with Him. Do we see that? Do we understand that? They had to take fully obedient action while fully recognizing what they were doing was not bringing about God's outcome. God was doing that. But they still had to fully act. So they were fully passive in the destruction of the city, and yet fully active in their covenant relationship with God. Fully passive in the destruction, fully active in the covenant relationship. Consider now Rahab. Consider Rahab and her choice. She knew what God had done in the past. She knew what God had done, and she believed that God would do what He said He was going to do. Right? She says, we know what He did to Egypt. We know how He saved you from Egypt, and I believe that He is going to give this land to you. She knows what God did in the past, and believes He is going to do what He says He's going to do, what He promises to do. And so what is Rahab's response? In faith, she chose to be on God's side. Do we see that? She sees what God has done, believes He will do as He promises, and so makes the decision to be on God's side. Is that sounding familiar to anybody? Does that sound a little bit like us, maybe? Consider this. She is powerless to prevent her own destruction, but she trusts in God by acting to enter into relationship with Him. She is powerless to prevent her own death, to prevent her own destruction in the city of Jericho, but she puts her trust in God, and she enters into relationship with Him. Look now at our own salvation and the works that God calls us to do. We can do nothing to destroy the fortified city of death that our own sin has built up. We can do nothing to prevent the destruction that our sin requires of us, but Jesus knocks down those walls. Jesus destroys that city. Jesus makes the impossible possible. He does what we are unable to do. We are fully passive in our own salvation, and yet we must be fully active in the establishment and maintenance of a covenant relationship with Him. We must be in relationship with Jesus for anything that He has done to affect us. And so we are powerless. We are passive in our salvation, and yet must be fully active in our covenant relationship with Him. And so I know what you're thinking, but Sam, if I'm fully passive, do I really need to be baptized? Yes! Of course you have to be baptized. In the same way that Rahab had to hang the cord outside of her home. In the same way that Israel had to march around the city exactly the way God instructed them to do. Neither of those things did the impossible work of God, but both indicated that the people involved were in covenant relationship with Him and that their obedience sprang forth from that relationship. We do things and make the same choices that these people had to make. We can do nothing to ensure our own salvation, but we can take full action to put ourselves in covenant relationship with Jesus, who then will do the work. Fully passive and fully active. Rahab, Israel, and us. This is why Rahab is commented on in both Hebrews and James. Hebrews 11:30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after welcoming the spies in peace. But then James says in 2:24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Fully passive and fully active. There should be no question of whether we're doing enough work to offset our sin. The answer is no. We can't do that. We are fully passive in that regard. But the question we can ask ourselves is, am I fully active in my covenant relationship with Jesus? The question we can ask ourselves, and that I want to leave you with this morning, man, I'm excited. Whose side are you on? That's the question that we ask ourselves. Whose side are you on? Have you recognized your powerless condition and trusted in God's power? If not, now is the time to choose. We can do it right now if you need to. Take action to be in covenant relationship with God. If so, if you've made that choice, are you fully active in that relationship? Are you fully active in the relationship you have with God? Are you strong and courageous to do all that God has commanded? Not because you're trying to knock down the walls by yourself, but because you know that God has already done so. That His army has already won the battle. You just get to choose to be on God's side. Let us go out today with the faith of Rahab. Let us go out today acting in loving kindness. Why? Because we have received loving kindness from God. Thank you for your attention this morning. And once again, I finished before the last bell. I hope you're proud.
Thank you very much for a great class.
Thank you.